this is Jason. We are reading Who Was Davy Crockett, Chapter 4 to Chapter 7. Chapter 4, David in Love. David Crockett did not have much luck with girls. While staying at the Canada's farm, he met a young girl and fell in love. David was so nervous about her, he barely could talk. Finally, he told her how he felt. She listened, but she wasn't interested in David. She liked someone else. That got David wondering. Maybe girls would like him better if he had an education. So he went back to school. 6 months later, David thought he was schooled enough to find a wife. He knew enough math to figure out money matters. He also had learned to read. Throughout his life, David was a big reader. At 18, he fell in love again. A girl's name was Margaret Elder. She lived about 10 miles away. John Kennedy didn't want David partying all night, but David liked to have fun, so he climbed out of his bedroom window, slid down a pole. He'd put outside and ride to Margaret's home. Margaret seemed to like David. They set a wedding date. Now David had to ask for her parents' permission to it. On the way to their house, however, David stopped at a frolic. A frolic was a frontier party where people did work at the same time. It might be a barn raising, or neighbors might clean land for a new settler. Usually there will be fiddle playing, dancing, and rifle shooting contests too. David enjoyed these contests and became known as a sure shot. At his frolic, he won a side of beef, which he sold for $5. Then he set off again to see Margaret. On the way, he saw Margaret's sister, and she told him something awful. Margaret had decided to marry someone else the very next day. David was shocked. Maybe he should have spoken to her parents right away and not stayed so long at the frolic. Twice David had fallen in love, and twice his heart had been broken. But then David went to another frolic. He met Mary Finley. Everyone called her Polly. He asked her to dance a reel. David wrote in his autobiography that he was well pleased her from the word go. After the frolic, David started paying visits to Polly. They talked and talked. Another man hoped Polly would marry him. Polly liked David better, though. They set a date to marry. August 1806. David had already asked Polly's parents for their daughter's hand in marriage, but it was also a custom to send an empty jug to the girl's house. If Polly's father filled the jug, it meant he approved of the marriage, and Polly's father did. After they were married, David and Polly rented a small farm close to Polly's parents. They kept cows and tended crops. Soon they had 2 sons, John Wesley and Willie. Their home was little more than a shack, made more from pine logs, stuck together with mud. It had 2 small rooms and no windows. David hunted for food and Polly made their clothes, but they could barely pay the rent. For 6 years they struggled. Towns in eastern Tennessee like Norville were growing, but David, 25 now, was more interested in the wilderness in western Tennessee. Would there be better land, more game? Tennessee Indians were losing more of this land to the U.S. government, and the government was opening up this land to settlers. David paid fees and taxes on 5 acres of state land in Lincoln County. Paying that money meant that he and his family could live on it. In the fall of 1811, the Crockett's moved there, about 150 miles west of Knoxville. The land was good for farming and hunting. It was here that I began to distinguish myself as a hunter and to lay the foundation for all my future greatness, David wrote in his autobiography. David was not nearly as interested in farming as he was in hunting. He became skilled at tracking bears. He learned how to read bear tracks, droppings, and claw marks on trees. For the Crockett, bear provided meat, oil, fur, ropes, and clothes. In the wilderness, there weren't stores or butchers. David and other pioneers hunted bears to survive. Still, the Crockett family struggled. Now David and Polly had a third child, a baby girl, also named Polly. When he couldn't keep paying for it, David lost the property. So the family moved to Beans Creek, just a few miles away. David was still on the move. Chapter 5, The Creek War. Around this time, a war broke out between the US and England. The War of 1812, also called the Second War of American Independence. English ships were seizing American ships and their crew in the Atlantic Ocean. The US said this had to stop. Many native tribes sided with the British. Why? The British agreed with Native Americans that it was wrong for settlers to keep moving west into areas where tribe always had lived. Fighting between settlers and Indians broke out in Alabama, near the Crockett home. After the Creek attack, a fort and nearly 500 people were killed. David decided to join in the fighting. I instantly felt like going, and I had none of the dread of dying that I expected to feel, he wrote later. Polly cried and begged for David to stay home. They had young children. She was alone in a new place with no family or friends. But David believed it was his duty to fight. So he chopped firewood for his family and brought in food and supplies. Then he left. On September 24, 1813, he signed up with the Tennessee Volunteer Mounted Riflemen. The regular U.S. Army was busy fighting the British, but volunteers in groups called militia for the Creeks. Each tour of duty lasted 3 months, so there wasn't much time to train. Afterward, the volunteer went back to their farm and stores. General Andrew Jackson was in charge of all the Tennessee volunteers. This was when he and David first met. David was made a scout, his job to find out where the Creek were heading. But he became upset. His report wasn't believed. David wrote, "Because I was no officer, I was no great man, but just a poor soldier. A rich man got more respect." That was one of the hateful ways of the world. Among the volunteers, however, David was very popular. He was someone they could count on. One man's account called David the merriest of the merry, keeping the camp alive with his jokes and stories. During the harsh winter, David spent his own money to buy blankets for soldiers, and he'd go hunting so the troops had enough food. In November, David was among 900 men who surrounded a small creek town. It was destroyed, a tragic loss for the Indians. David did not enjoy warfare. When the fighting wound down and the U.S. victory was in sight, he was happy to go home. "Though I was only a rough sort of backwoodsman," he wrote, "his family seemed mighty glad to see me. His days as a soldier were gone." Chapter 6, An End and a Beginning. David wrote that after the war, I met with the hardest trial which ever falls of the lot of men. His beloved wife, Polly, fell sick. 2 weeks later, she died. She was only 26. No one knows for sure how Polly died. In 1815, Tennessee doctors were few and far between, and even doctors did not know how to treat many illnesses. Smallpox, typhoid fever, and other deadly diseases swept through the frontier. Heartbroken, David still had to care for his 3 young children. He didn't want to send them into different homes, which often happened back then. David realized that he needed a new wife in order to keep his family together. Not far away, Elizabeth Harton lived with her young children, George and Margaret Ann. Her husband had died in the Creek War. She was a practical woman and a hard worker. David and Elizabeth married in the summer of 1816. He and Elizabeth planned to sell most of their homes to pay off debts. Then they would settle farther out west. There was a lot of land to be had after the Creek defeat. Once again, David was on the move. That fall, he explored the wilderness farther west in Lawrence country. 31 years old, a wife and family. He couldn't stay home for long. He'd get too restless. Itchy fruited, a friend would call him. David found exactly the kind of spot he was looking for. Land by Sherrill Creek in Lawrence Country, Tennessee. By now, David could read and write better than most Westerners. He was known to be honest. People liked him. He was good at telling stories. And out west, people loved storytelling. Back then, countries elected colonies and majors to head state regiment. David decided to run for colonial. David explained to voters that he was just like they were, a simple man, a common Westerner in March of 1818. David won the election. The title of colonial would stay with him the rest of his life, and so would a love of campaigning. Chapter 7, Crockett Speaks Up. Over time, David held other government offices. It seemed only natural that he would run for the state assembly, whereas members of the U.S. Congress passed laws for the whole country. People in state governments passed laws that affect just their states. David began to campaign. Most politicians like to talk for a long time. Not David. He liked to tell some laughable story and quit. People were taken with David. In February 1821, he won the election. Even so, being a Tennessee assemblyman was a part-time job. He still needed to earn more money. With $3,000 of his own money, David, like his father, built mills along a river. It was a risky move. Only 12 days after arriving at the state of capital Murfreesboro, David had to go back home. Summer storms and a flash flood had carried away his mills. David lost everything. He had to sell his home and the land. David had 3 more children now, a son, Robert Patron, a daughter, Rebecca, and baby, Matilda Elizabeth. And all 8 children went to live with relatives. Elizabeth was used to David's long hunting trips. He'd be gone for months. Still, his parting must have been difficult. But David had a job to do. He returned to the capital. In the state assembly, David supported some rights for African Americans. He voted against a law that would allow the capture and sale of freed slaves. Slavery was common in Tennessee. Even David, a poor man, owned a few slaves over the years, but maybe he knew, deep down, this was wrong. At work, David wore plain, worn-out clothes. Other assemblymen dressed in fancy shirts and coats with cotton ruffles at the collars. Was David as good as they were? He wanted to think so, and he wanted to convince others too. Maybe Schumann could help, he thought. One day, David found a ruffle lying on the street. He pinned it on his worn shirt. When he rose to speak in the assembly, everyone laughed. However, David knew they were laughing with him. Once, a man had called him the gentleman from the cane. At first, David took it as an insult. Cane bamboo grew in a poor part of Tanzania where land was hard to farm. But in time, David didn't mind if people called him that nickname. In fact, he liked it.